Hey there, everybody. I'm over here with Howl's Moving Castle and a stack full of semi-sweet chocolate chips left over from when I baked. Um, Originally, I was planning on reading Neverwhere, but my friend Marilyn said that this is her favorite book, and I like it a lot, and I already read it to somebody who's important to me, so I wanted to read it again. So, Chapter 3, in which Sophie enters into a castle and a bargain. There was a large black door in the black wall facing Sophie, and she made for that, hobbling briskly. The castle was uglier than ever close to. It was far too tall for its height, and not a very regular shape. As far as Sophie could see in the growing darkness, it was built of huge black blocks like coal, and like coal, the blocks were all different shapes and sizes. A chill breathed off these blocks as she got closer, but that failed to frighten Sophie at all. She just thought of chairs and firesides and stretched her hand out eagerly to the door. Her hand could not come near it. Some invisible wall stopped her hand about a foot from the door. Sophie prodded at it with an irritable finger. When that made no difference, she prodded at it with her stick. The wall seemed to be all over the door from as high as her stick could reach, and right down to the heather sticking out from under the doorstep. "Open up!" Sophie cackled at it. That made no difference to the wall. "Very well," Sophie said. "I'll find your back door." She hobbled off to the left-hand corner of the castle, that being both nearest and slightly downhill. But she could not get round the corner. The invisible wall stopped her again as soon as she was level with the irregular black cornerstones. At this, Sophie said a word that she had learned from Martha, that neither old ladies nor young girls are supposed to know, and stumped uphill and anti-clockwise, or widdershins, to the castle's right-hand corner. There was no barrier there. She turned that corner and hobbled eagerly towards the second big black door in the middle of that side of the castle. There was a barrier over that door, too. Sophie glowered at it. "I call that very unwelcoming," she said. Black smoke blew down from the battlements in clouds, and Sophie coughed. Now she was angry. She was old, frail, chilly, and aching all over. Night was coming on, and the castle just sat and blew smoke at her. "I'll speak to Howl about this," she said, and she set off fiercely to the next corner. There was no barrier there. Evidently, you had to go round the castle widdershins. But there, a bit sideways in the next wall, was a third door, and this one was much smaller and much shabbier. "Ah, the back door at last," Sophie said. The castle started to move again as Sophie got near the back door. The ground shook, the wall shuddered and creaked, and the door started to travel away sideways from her. "Oh, no, you don't!" Sophie shouted. She ran after the door and hit it violently with her stick. "Open up!" she yelled. The door sprang open inwards, still moving away sideways. Sophie, by hobbling furiously, managed to get one foot up onto its doorstep. Then she hopped and scrambled and hopped again, while the great black blocks round the door jolted and crunched as the castle gathered speed over the uneven hillside. Sophie did not wonder the castle had a lopsided look. The marvel was that it did not fall apart on the spot. "What a stupid way to treat a building," she panted, as she threw herself inside it. She had to drop her stick and hang on to the open door in order to not be jolted out straight again. When she began to get her breath, she realized that there was a person standing in front of her, holding the door too. He was a head taller than Sophie, but she could see that he was the merest child, only a little older than Martha, and he seemed to be trying to shut the door on her and push her out of the warm, lamplit, low-beamed room beyond him, into the night again. "Don't you have the impudence to shut the door on me, my boy," she said. "I wasn't going to, but you're keeping the door open. What do you want?" Sophie looked round at what she could see beyond the boy. There were a number of probably wizardly things hanging from the beams, strings of onions, bunches of herbs, and bundles of strange roots. There were also definitely wizardly things, like leather books, crooked bottles, and an old brown, grinning human skull. On the other side of the boy was a fireplace, with a small fire burning in the grate. It was much smaller fire than all the smoke outside suggested, but then this was obviously only a back room in the castle. Much more important to Sophie, this fire had reached the glowing rosy stage, with little blue flames dancing on the logs, and placed beside it, in the warmest position, was a low chair with a cushion on it. Sophie pushed the boy aside and dove for the chair. "Oh, my fortune," she said, settling herself comfortably in it. It was bliss. The fire warmed her aches, and the chair supported her back, and she knew that if anybody wanted her to turn her out now, they were going to have to use extreme and violent magic to do it. The boy shut the door. Then he picked up Sophie's stick and politely leaned it against the chair for her. Sophie realized that there was now no sign at all that the castle was moving across the hillside. Not even the ghost of a rumble, nor the tiniest shaking. How odd. "Tell Wizard Howl," she said to the boy, "that this castle's going to come apart round his ears if it travels much further." "Oh, the castle's bespelled to hold together," the boy said, "but I'm afraid Howl's not here at just the moment." This was good news to Sophie. "When will he be back?" she asked a little nervously. "Oh, probably not until tomorrow now," the boy said. "What do you want? Can I help you instead? I'm Howl's apprentice, Michael." Which is a very good name, by the way. This was better news than ever. "I'm afraid only the wizard can possibly help me," Sophie said, quickly and firmly. It was probably true, too. "I'll wait if you don't mind." It was clear that Michael did mind. He hovered over her a little helplessly, to make it plain to him that she had no intention of being turned out by a mere boy apprentice. Sophie closed her eyes and pretended to go to sleep. "Tell him the name's Sophie," she murmured. "Old Sophie," she added to be on the safe side. "That'll probably mean waiting all night," Michael said. Since this was exactly what Sophie wanted, she pretended not to hear. In fact, she almost certainly fell into a swift doze. She was so tired from all of that walking. After a moment, Michael gave her up, and went back to the work that he was doing at the workbench where the lamp stood. So she would have a whole night's shelter, even if it was only on slightly false pretenses. Sophie thought drowsily. Since Howl was such a wicked man, it probably served him right to be imposed upon. But she intended to be well away from here by the time that Howl came back and raised objections. She looked sleepily and slyly across at the apprentice. It rather surprised her to find such a nice, polite boy. After all, she had forced her way in quite rudely, and Michael had not complained at all. Perhaps Howl kept him in abject servility, but Michael did not look servile. He was a tall, dark boy with a pleasant, open sort of face, and he was most respectably dressed. In fact, if Sophie had not seen him at that moment carefully pouring green fluid out of a crooked flask onto black powder in a bent glass jar, she would have taken him for the son of a prosperous farmer. How odd. Still, things were bound to be odd where wizards were concerned, Sophie thought, and this kitchen, or workshop, was beautifully cozy and very peaceful. Sophie went properly to sleep and snored. She did not wake up when there came a flash and a muted bang from the workbench, followed by a hurriedly bitten-off swear word from Michael. She did not wake when Michael, sucking his burned fingers, put the spell aside for the night and fetched bread and cheese out of the closet. She did not stir when Michael knocked her stick down with a clatter, reached over her for a log to put on the fire, nor when Michael, looking down into Sophie's open mouth, remarked to the fireplace, "She's got all her teeth. She's not the Witch of the Waste, is she?" "I wouldn't have let her in if she was," the fireplace retorted. Michael shrugged and picked Sophie's stick up politely again. Then he put a log on the fire with equal politeness and went away to bed somewhere overhead. In the middle of the night, Sophie was woken by someone snoring. She jumped upright, rather irritated to discover that she was the one who had been snoring. It seemed to her that she had only dropped off for a second or so, but Michael seemed to have vanished in those seconds, taking the light with him. No doubt a wizard's apprentice learned to do that kind of thing in his first week, and he'd left the fire very low. It was giving out irritated hissings and poppings. A cold draft blew on Sophie's back. Sophie recalled that she was in the wizard's castle, and also with unpleasant distinctiveness. that there was a human skull on a workbench somewhere behind her. She shivered and cranked her stiff old neck round, but there was only darkness behind her. "Let's have a little bit more light, shall we?" she said. Her cracked little voice seemed to make no more noise than the crackling of the fire. Sophie was surprised. She had expected it to echo through the vaults of the castle. Still, there was a basket of logs behind her. She stretched out a creaking arm and heaved a log onto the fire, which sent a spray of green and blue sparks flying up the chimney. She heaved on a second log and sat back, not without a nervous look or so behind her, where the blue-purple light from the fire was dancing over the polished brown bone of the skull. The room was quite small. There was no one in it but Sophie and the skull. "He's got both feet in the grave, and I've only got one," she consoled herself. She turned back to the fire, which was now flaring up into blue and green flames. "Must be salt in that wood," Sophie murmured. She settled herself more comfortably, putting her knobbly feet on the fender and her head into a corner of the chair where she could stare into the colored flames, and began dreamily considering what she ought to do in the morning. But she was sidetracked a little by imagining a face in the flames. "It would be a thin blue face," she murmured, "very long and thin, with a thin blue nose, but those curly green flames on top are most definitely your hair. Suppose I didn't go until Howl gets back. Wizards can lift spells, I suppose. And those purple flames near the bottom make the mouth. You have a savage teeth, my friend. You have 2 green tufts of flame for eyebrows." Curiously enough, the only orange flames in the fire were under the green eyebrow flames, just like eyes, and they each had a little purple glint in the middle that Sophie could almost imagine was looking at her, like the pupil of an eye. "On the other hand," Sophie continued, looking into the orange flames, "if the spell was off, I'd have my heart eaten before I could turn round." "Well, don't you want your heart eaten?" asked the fire. It was definitely the fire that spoke. Sophie saw its purple mouth move as the words came. Its voice was nearly as cracked as her own, full of spitting and whining of burning wood. "Well, naturally I don't. What are you?" "I am a great and powerful fire demon," answered the purple mouth. There was more whine than spit to its voice as it said, "I'm bound to this hearth by contract. I can't move from this spot." Then its voice became brisk and crackling. "What are you?" it asked. "I can see you're under a spell." This roused Sophie from her dreamlike state. "You see!" she exclaimed. "Can you take the spell off?" There was a popping, blazing silence while the orange eyes and demon's wavering blue face traveled up and down Sophie. "It's a strong spell," it said at length. "It feels like one of the Witch of the Waste to me." "It is," said Sophie. "But it seems more than that," crackled the demon. "I detect 2 layers, and of course you won't be able to tell anyone about it unless they know already." It gazed at Sophie a moment longer. "I shall have to study it," it said. "How long will that take?" Sophie asked. "It may take a while," said the demon, and it added in a soft, persuasive flicker, "How about you make a bargain with me? I'll break your spell if you agree to break this contract that I'm under." Sophie looked warily at the demon's thin blue face. It had a distinctly cunning look as it made its proposal. Everything she'd read showed the extreme danger of making a bargain with a demon, and there was no doubt that this one did look extraordinarily evil. Those long, purple teeth. "Are you quite sure you're being honest?" she said. "Well, not completely," answered the demon. "But do you want to stay like this until you die? That spell has shortened your life by about 60 years, if I'm any judge of such things." This was a nasty thought, and one which Sophie had tried not to think about up till now. It made quite a difference. "This contract you're under," she said, "it's with the wizard Howl, isn't it?" "Oh, of course," said the fire demon. Its voice took on a bit of a whine again. "I'm fastened to this hearth, and I can't stir so much as a foot away. I'm forced to do most of the magic around here. I have to maintain the castle, I have to keep it moving and do all the special effects that scare people off, as well as anything else that Howl wants. Howl's quite heartless, you know. Sophie did not need telling that Howl was heartless. On the other hand, the demon was probably quite as wicked. Well, don't you get anything out of this contract at all? I wouldn't have entered it into it if I didn't, said the demon, flickering sadly. But I wouldn't have done it if I'd known what it would be like. I'm being exploited. In spite of her caution, Sophie felt a good deal of sympathy for the demon. She thought of herself making hats for Fanny, while Fanny went gadding. All right, she said. What are the terms of the contract, and how do I break it? The eager purple grin spread across the demon's blue face. You agree to the bargain? If you agree to break the spell on me, Sophie said, with a brave sense of saying something fatal. Done, said the demon, his long face leaping gleefully up the chimney. I'll break your spell the very instant you break my contract. Well, then tell me how to break your contract, Sophie said. The orange eyes glinted at her and looked away. I can't. Part of the contract is that neither the wizard nor I can say what the main clause is. Sophie saw that she'd been tricked. She opened her mouth to tell the demon that it could sit in the fireplace until doomsday in that case. The demon realized what she was going to do. Oh, don't be hasty. You can find out what it is if you watch and you listen carefully. I implore you to try. The contract isn't doing either of us any good in the long run, and I do keep my word. The fact that I'm stuck here shows that I keep it. It was in earnest, leaping about on its logs in an agitated way. Sophie again felt a great deal of sympathy. But if I'm to watch and listen, that means I have to stay here in Howl's castle, she objected. Only about a month. Remember, I have to study your spell, too. Well, what possible excuse can I give for doing that? Sophie asked. We'll think of one. Howl's pretty useless at most things, in fact, the demon said, venomously hissing. He's too wrapped up in himself to see beyond his own nose half the time. We can deceive him as long as you agree to stay. Very well, Sophie said. I'll stay. Now find an excuse. She settled herself comfortably in the chair while the demon thought. It thought aloud in a little crackling, flickering murmur, which reminded Sophie rather of the way that she talked to her stick when she walked here, and it blazed while it thought with such a glad and powerful roaring that she dozed again. She thought the demon did make a few suggestions. She remembered shaking her head to the notion that she could pretend to be Howl's long-lost great-aunt, and to one or two others even far more far-fetched, but she did not remember very clearly. At length the demon fell into singing a gentle, flickering little song. It was not in any language Sophie knew, or she thought not, until she distinctly heard the word saucepan in it several times, and it was very sleepy-sounding. Sophie fell into a deep sleep, with a slight suspicion that she was being bewitched now, as well as beguiled, but it did not bother her particularly. She would be free of the spell soon. Oh. Oh. That nice security guard is pulled around again. I've run into him a few times. He's really very polite. Very friendly. Plus, I'm grateful that he works. Tries his best to make the place safe. Also, worth noting, there was a clue in that last chapter, but I'm not going to point it out. But really, I It's one of the things that I very much enjoy about this book, is the author is very clever. Chapter 4, in which Sophie discovers several strange things. When Sophie woke up, daylight was streaming across her. Since Sophie remembered no windows at all in the castle, her first notion was that she'd fallen asleep trimming hats and dreamt of leaving home. The fire in front of her had sunk to rosy charcoal and white ash, which convinced her that she had certainly dreamed that there was a fire demon. But her very first movements told her that there were some things that she had not dreamed. There were sharp cracks from all over her body. "Ow!" she exclaimed. "I ache all over." The voice that exclaimed was a weak, cracked piping. She put her knobbly hands to her face and felt wrinkles. At that she discovered that she had been in a state of shock all yesterday. She was very angry indeed with the Witch of the Waste for doing this to her, hugely, enormously angry. "Sailing into shops and turning people old," she exclaimed. "Oh, what I wouldn't do to her." The anger made her jump up in a salvo of cracks and creaks and hobble over to the unexpected window. It was above the workbench. To her utter astonishment, the view from it was a view of a dockside town. She could see a sloping, unpaved street, lined with small, rather poor-looking houses, and masts sticking up beyond the roofs. Beyond the masts, she caught a glimmer of the sea, which was something that she had never in her life seen before. "Wherever am I?" Sophie asked the skull standing on the bench. "I don't expect you to answer that, my friend," she added, hastily remembering. "This is a wizard's castle," and she turned round to take a look at the room. It was quite a small room, with heavy black beams in the ceiling. By daylight it was amazingly dirty. The stones on the floor were stained and greasy, ash piled within the fender, and cobwebs hung in dusty droops from the beams. There was a layer of dust on the skull. Sophie absently wiped it off as she went to peer into the sink beside the workbench. She shuddered at the pink and gray slime in it, and the white slime dripping from the pump above it. Howl obviously did not care what squalor his servants lived in. Tasty, tasty chuckies. The rest of the castle had to be beyond one or the other of the 4 low black doors about the room. Sophie opened the nearest, in the end wall beyond the bench. There was a large bathroom beyond it. In some ways, it was a bathroom you might normally find only in a palace, full of luxuries such as an indoor toilet, a shower stall, an immense bath with clawed feet, and mirrors on every wall. But it was even dirtier than the other room. Sophie winced from the toilet, flinched at the color of the bath, recoiled from the green weed growing in the shower, and quite easily avoided looking at her shriveled shape in the mirrors, because the glass was plastered with blobs and runnels of nameless substances. The nameless substances themselves were crowded onto a very large shelf over the bath. They were in jars, boxes, tubes, and hundreds of tattered brown packets and paper bags. The biggest jar had a name. It was called drying powder in crooked letters. Sophie was not sure whether there should be a D in that or not. She picked up a packet at random. It had skin scrawled on it, and she put it back hurriedly. Another jar said eyes in the same scrawl. A tube stated, "For decay." "It seems to work, too," Sophie murmured, looking into the wash basin with a shiver. Water ran into the basin when she turned a blue-green knob that might have been brass and washed some of the decay away. Sophie rinsed her hands and face in the water without touching the basin, but she did not have the courage to use the drying powder. She dried the water with her skirt and then set off to the next black door. That one opened into a flight of rickety wooden stairs. Sophie heard someone move up there and shut the door hurriedly. It seemed only to lead to a sort of loft anyway. She hobbled to the next door. By now she was moving quite easily. She was a hale old woman, as she'd discovered yesterday. The third door opened onto a poky backyard with high brick walls. It contained a big stack of logs and higgledy-piggledy heaps of what seemed to be scrap iron wheels, buckets, metal sheeting, wire mounted almost to the tops of the walls. Sophie shut that door too, rather puzzled, because it did not seem to match the castle at all. There was no castle to be seen above the brick walls. They ended at the sky. Sophie could only think that this part was round the side where the invisible wall had stopped her the night before. She opened the fourth door, and it was just a broom cupboard, with two fine but dusty velvet cloaks hanging from the brooms. Sophie shut it again, slowly this time. The only other door was in the wall with the window, and that was the door that she'd come in by last night. She hobbled over and cautiously opened it. She stood for a moment, looking out at a slowly moving view of the hills, watching Heather slide past underneath the door, feeling the wind blow her wispy hair, and listening to the rumble and grind of the big black stones as the castle moved. Then she shut the door and went to the window, and there was the seaport town again. It was no picture. A woman had opened the door opposite and was sweeping the dust into the street. Beside that house, a grayish canvas sail was going up a mast in brisk jerks, disturbing a flock of seagulls into flying round and round against the glimmering sea. "I don't understand," Sophie told the human skull. Then, because the fire looked almost out, she went and put a couple of logs and raked away some of the ash. Green flames climbed between the logs, small and curly, shot up into a long blue face with flaming green hair. "Good morning," said the fire demon. "Don't forget, we have a bargain." So none of it was a dream. Sophie was not much given to crying, but she sat in the chair for quite a while, staring at the blurred and sliding fire demon, and did not pay much attention to the sounds of Michael getting up until she found him standing beside her, looking embarrassed and a little exasperated. "You're still here," he said. "Is something the matter?" Sophie sniffed. "I'm old," she began. But it was just as the witch had said and the fire demon had guessed. Michael said cheerfully, "Well, it comes to all of us in time. Would you like some breakfast?" Sophie discovered that she was a very hale old woman indeed. After only bread and cheese at lunchtime yesterday, she was ravenous. "Yes," she said, and when Michael went to the closet in the wall, she sprang up and peered over his shoulder to see what there was to eat. "I'm afraid there's only bread and cheese," Michael said, rather stiffly. "But there's a whole basket of eggs in there," Sophie said. "And isn't that bacon? What about a hot drink as well? Where's your kettle?" "There isn't one," Michael said. "Howl's the only one who can cook." "I can cook," Sophie said. "Unhook that frying pan and I'll show you." She reached for the large black pan hanging on the closet wall in spite of Michael trying to prevent her. "You don't understand," Michael said. "It's Calcifer the fire demon. He won't bend down his head to be cooked on by anyone but Howl." Sophie turned and looked at the fire demon. He flickered back at her wickedly. "I refuse to be exploited," he said. "You mean," Sophie said to Michael, "that you have to do without even a hot drink unless Howl's here?" Michael gave an embarrassed nod. "Then you're the one being exploited," said Sophie. "Give that here." She wrenched the pan from Michael's resisting fingers, plonked the bacon onto it, popped a handy wooden spoon into the egg basket, and marched with the lot to the fireplace. "Now, Calcifer," she said, "let's have no more nonsense. Bend down your head." "You can't make me," crackled the fire demon. "Oh, yes, I can," Sophie crackled back, with the ferocity that had oft stopped both her sisters in mid-fight. "If you don't, I shall pour water on you, or I shall pick up the tongs and take away both of your logs," she added as she got herself creakingly onto her knees by the hearth. "There," she whispered. "Or I can go back on our bargain, or tell Howl about it, can't I?" "Oh, curses!" Calcifer spat. "Why did you let her in here, Michael?" Sulkily, he bent his blue face forward until all that could be seen of him was a ring of curly green flames dancing on the logs. "Thank you," Sophie said, and slapped the heavy pan onto the green ring to make sure Calcifer did not suddenly rise up again. "I hope your bacon burns," Calcifer said. muffled under the pan. Sophie slapped slices of bacon onto the pan. It was good and hot. The bacon sizzled, and she had to wrap her skirt around her hand to hold the handle. The door opened, but she did not notice because of the sizzling. "Oh, don't be silly," she told Calcifer, "and hold still because I want to break the eggs." "Oh, hello, Howl," Michael said helplessly. Sophie turned round at that, rather hurriedly. She stared. The tall young fellow in a flamboyant blue and silver shirt, who had just come in, stopped in the act of leaning a guitar in the corner. He brushed the fair hair from his rather curious glass-green eyes and stared back. His long, angular face was perplexed. "And who on earth are you?" said Howl. "Where have I seen you before?" "I am a total stranger," Sophie lied firmly. After all, Howl had only met her long enough to call her a mouse before, so it was almost true. She ought to have been thanking her stars for the lucky escape she'd had then, she supposed, but in fact her main thought was, good gracious, Wizard Howl is only a child in his 20s for all his wickedness. It made such a difference to be old, she thought, as she turned the bacon over in the pan, and she would have died rather than let this overdressed boy know that she was the girl he'd pitied on May Day. Hearts and souls did not enter into it. Howl was not going to know. "She says her name's Sophie," Michael said. "She came in last night." "How did she make Calcifer bend down?" said Howl. "She bullied me," Calcifer said in a piteous, muffled voice from under the sizzling pan. "Well, not many people can do that," Howl said thoughtfully. He propped his guitar in the corner and came over to the hearth. The smell of hyacinths mixed with the smell of bacon as he shoved Sophie firmly aside. "Calcifer doesn't like anyone but me to cook on him," he said, kneeling down and wrapping one trailing sleeve around his hand to hold the pan. "Pass me 2 more slices of bacon and 6 eggs, please, and tell me why you're here." Sophie stared at the jewel hanging from Howl's ear and passed him egg after egg. "Why I came, young man," she said. It was obvious after what she'd seen of the castle. "I came because I'm your new cleaning lady, of course." "Oh, are you indeed?" Howl said, cracking the eggs one-handed and tossing the shells handsomely among the logs, where Calcifer seemed to be eating them with a lot of snarling and gobbling. "And who says you are?" "I do," said Sophie, and she added piously, "I can clean the dirt from this place even if I can't clean you from your wickedness, young man." "Howl's not wicked," Michael said. "Yes, I am," Howl contradicted him. "You forget just how wicked I'm being at the moment, Michael." He jerked his chin to Sophie. "If you're so anxious to be of use, my good woman, find some knives and forks and clear the bench." There were tall stools under the workbench. Michael was pulling them out to sit on and pushing aside all the things on top of it to make room for some knives and forks he'd taken from a drawer in the side of it. Sophie went to help him. She'd not expected Howl to welcome her, of course, but he had not even so far agreed to let her stay beyond breakfast. Since Michael did not seem to need help, Sophie shuffled over to her stick and put it slowly and showily in the broom cupboard. When that did not seem to attract Howl's attention, she said, "You can take me on for a month's trial if you'd like." Wizard Howl said nothing but, "Plates, please, Michael." He stood up, holding the smoking pan. Calcifer sprang up with a roar of relief and blazed high in the chimney. Sophie made another attempt to pin the wizard down. "If I'm going to be cleaning here for the next month," she said, "I'd like to know where the rest of the castle is. I can only find this one room and the bathroom." To her surprise, both Michael and the wizard roared with laughter. It was not until they had almost finished breakfast that Sophie discovered what had made them laugh. Howl was not only hard to pin down, he seemed to dislike answering any question at all. Sophie gave up asking him and asked Michael instead. "Tell her," said Howl, "or stop her pestering." "Well, there isn't any more of the castle," Michael said, "except what you've seen in 2 bedrooms upstairs." "What?" Sophie exclaimed. Howl and Michael laughed again. Howl and Calcifer invented the castle, Michael explained. Calcifer keeps it going. The inside of it is really just Howl's old house in Porthaven, which is actually the only real part. But Porthaven's miles down near the sea, Sophie said. I call that too bad. What do you mean by having this great ugly castle rushing around the hills and frightening everyone in Market Chipping to death? What an outspoken old woman you are. I've reached that stage in my career when I need to impress everyone with my power and my wickedness. I can't have the king thinking well of me, and last year I offended someone very powerful, and I need to keep out of their way. It seemed a funny way to avoid someone, but Sophie supposed wizards had different standards from ordinary people, and she shortly discovered that the castle had other peculiarities. They'd finished eating, and Michael was piling the plates in the slimy sink beside the bench when there came a loud, hollow knocking at the door. Calcifer blazed. Kingsbury door! Howl, who was on his way to the bathroom, went to the door instead. There was a square wooden knob above the door, set into the lintel, with a dab of paint on each of its 4 sides. At that moment, there was a green blob on the side that was at the bottom, but Howl turned the knob round so that it had a red blob downward before he opened the door. Outside stood a personage wearing a stiff white wig and a wide hat on top of that. He was clothed in scarlet and purple and gold, and he held up a little staff decorated with ribbons, like an infant maypole. He bowed. Scents of cloves and orange blossoms blew into the room. His Majesty, the King, presents his compliments and sends payment for 2,000 pair of 7-league boots, this person said. Behind him, Sophie had glimpses of a coach waiting in a street full of sumptuous houses covered in painted carvings, and towers and spires and domes beyond that, of a splendor she'd barely before imagined. She was sorry it took so little time for the person at the door to hand over a long, silken, chinking purse, and for Howl to take the purse, bow, and shut the door. Howl turned the square knob back so that the green blob was downward again, and stowed the long purse in his pocket. Sophie saw Michael's eyes follow the purse in an urgent and worried way. Howl went straight to the bathroom then, calling out, I need hot water in here, Calcifer, and was gone for a long, long time. Sophie could not restrain her curiosity. Whoever was that at the door? She asked Michael. Or do I mean, where? Oh, that door gives on Kingsbury, Michael said. Where the king lives. I think that man was the Chancellor's clerk, and, he added worriedly to Calcifer, do wish he hadn't given Howl all that money. Is Howl going to let me stay here? Sophie asked. Well, if he is, you'll never pin him down, Michael answered. He hates being pinned down to anything. I think that 2 chapters is plenty enough for one evening, my beloved. So, besides, you have much more important things to do than listen to me. So, do your best, get some rest, and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And remember that if people can hate without reason, then I can love you for absolutely no reason at all. So, take good care of yourself and get some sleep. I love you very much.